afternoon. I think we will endeavor to get started. I'm sure there will be a few more people coming in out of the cold and the wet in just a few minutes. Welcome to all of you here at the Joukowsky Forum and also those of you watching online. Today we are very happy to present the next in our series of cybersecurity talks that will explore current issues and challenges in law, public policy, international relations, data privacy, and information security. My name is Alan Eustace, and I am the director of Brown's new degree program, the Executive Master in Cybersecurity. The EMCS program aims to bring Brown faculty expertise to address the pressing need for cross-disciplinary, strategic, and visionary leaders with the unique and critical ability to devise and execute integrated, comprehensive cybersecurity strategies for nations and industries across the globe. In the program, as the banner says outside, we say strategy is the best security. Please come and talk to me following today's presentation if you'd like to hear more about the EMCS program, or look us up at brown.edu cybersecurity. There you're also going to find information about upcoming events in the speaker series. Tim Edgar spoke at the first of these talks, and it's fitting that he introduce today's speaker to you. Tim is the Academic Director for Law and Policy in the EMCS program and also Senior Fellow here at Watson. Tim?
Thank you very much, Alan. I'm delighted to be here to welcome a very special guest, Helen Nissenbaum. She's a professor of media, culture, and communication and computer science at New York University, where she's also the director of the Information Law Institute. Her work spans societal, ethical, and political dimensions of information technology and digital media. Professor Nissenbaum's 9 books include Obfuscation, A User's Guide for Privacy and Protest, just published last year by MIT Press, Values at Play in Digital Games, and Privacy in Context, Technology, Policy, and the Integrity of Social Life. One thing that I think is wonderful about Helen, although there are many things wonderful about her, is that her PhD is actually in philosophy, unlike many people who have doctors of philosophy in something else. And I think that privacy is an area that requires a philosophical approach, and that is something that Professor Nissenbaum is well known for. She has changed my view and my understanding of privacy. I have worked in this field for many years as a practitioner, both as a privacy advocate and as a lawyer inside the government. And one question I always had was, are we stuck with these fair information practice principles from the 1970s as our only definition of privacy? Or should we instead use the Fourth Amendment? Should we instead use some other way of thinking about privacy? Professor Nissenbaum is a great thinker in terms of what do we really mean. We sort of know when something feels like it violates our sense of what privacy is and when it doesn't, but it doesn't always match up with the policy or legal frameworks that we've articulated or the technological frameworks that we've articulated to think about these issues. So with all of that said, I'm delighted to welcome Helen here to Brown.
Well, Timothy, thank you very much for that great introduction. Thank you. I've learned a little bit about your program, and it sounds actually incredible. And for the opportunity to present this work. I hope you will forgive me for speaking on work that's very much in progress. There is a draft of a paper, and it's unfinished. There's a recommendations section that says TK. And so I really look forward to your remarks. But it's something I've been thinking about for quite a long time. So it's not completely fresh. Fresh is a good word. It's a good thing. Yeah. No. Okay. It is fresh. I think I made this big enough so that we can read it together. And I want to be a little bit careful in reading things together, though I know, when you do PowerPoints, you're not supposed to read what's on the slide, but I'm hoping that we can. So here is something that was written recently in the PCAST report, 2014. Policy attention should focus more on the actual use of big data and less on its collection and analysis. By actual uses, we mean the specific events where something happens that can cause an adverse consequence or harm to an individual or class of individuals. In the context of big data, these events are almost always actions of a computer program or app interacting either with the raw data or the fruits of analysis of those data. In this formulation, it is not the data themselves that cause the harm, nor the program itself, absent any data, but the confluence of the two. These use events embody the necessary specificity to be the subject of regulation. By contrast, PCAST judges that policies focused on the regulation of data collection, storage, retention, a priori limitations on application and analysis are unlikely to yield effective strategies for improving privacy. Such policies would be unlikely to scale over time and be enforceable by other than severe and economically damaging measures. So that's one rendering. Here's another one, Craig Mundy in an article in Foreign Affairs. He had held a high position, it still does, in Microsoft. I forget what exactly it is. The widespread and perpetual collection and storage of personal data have become practically inevitable. Every day, people knowingly provide enormous amounts of data to a wide array of organizations, including government agencies, internet service providers, telecoms, financial firms. Such organizations also obtain massive quantities of data through passive collection, where people provide data in the act of doing something else, for example, by simply moving from one place to another while carrying a GPS-enabled cell phone. Indeed, there's hardly any part of one's life that does not emit some sort of data exhaust as a byproduct. Meanwhile, ever more powerful processors and servers have made it possible to analyze all this data and to generate new insights and inferences. Today's laws and regulations focus largely on controlling the collection and retention of personal data, an approach that's becoming impractical for individuals while also potentially cutting off future uses of data that could benefit society. The time has come for a new approach, shifting the focus from limiting the collection and retention of data to controlling data at the most important point, the moment when it is used. Now, Omer Tene and Jules Palahnitzky, who are in the privacy legal community and have written quite a lot now, by now, on big data and law, the big data business model is antithetical to data minimization. And that's a European concept that means you collect only the minimum required information in order for some particular functionality. It incentivizes collection of more data for longer periods of time. It is aimed precisely at those unanticipated secondary uses, the crown jewels of big data. After all, who could have anticipated that Bing search queries would be used to unearth harmful drug interactions? Legal rules collide with technological and business realities. Organizations today collect and retain personal data through multiple channels, including the internet, mobile, biological, industrial sensors, video, email, and social networking tools. Modern organizations amass data collected directly from individuals or third parties, and they harvest private, semi-public, e.g. Facebook, or public, e.g. the electoral roll sources. Data minimization is simply no longer the market norm. And then this is the last one, and this is a European privacy law scholar, Bert-Jaap Koops. How can data protection meet the challenge of decisions increasingly being taken on the basis of large-scale, complex, and multi-purpose processes of matching and mining enormous amounts of data? the focus in data protection should shift from ex ante regulation of data processing to ex post regulation of decision making, supporting an alternative approach, one that focuses less on data minimization, as I mentioned before, user control and procedural accountability, but instead directs its arrows at the outcome of computation-based decision making, the decision itself. So these are all different angles on the thesis that I'm going to call big data exceptionalism. And I mean, I just made up that word, I think. I don't know that anyone else uses it, so that I would have one word to use rather than have to repeat the thesis over and over again. And the thesis is this: in light of big data, we should regulate data use, but not data collection. And that's a summation of those quotes that I gave earlier. And of course, probably if you're thinking as you're listening, you're realizing that I've shoved a lot under the rug. So just to give you some quick examples, those of you who may follow the news, you may remember in 2010 when it was, I think it was then, when it was discovered that the Google Street View vans driving around were, not only photographing the streets and the exterior of houses, but they were also picking up the Wi-Fi addresses. And oh, by the way, all the Wi-Fi signals that were unencrypted were also being recorded. Now, under this kind of regime, no problem, right? Just collection is not an issue. It's only how you use. And you may even think about the NSA, at least now things have changed a little bit, saying that we're just collecting all this information. We're not going to look at it unless there's probable cause. So we're just kind of accumulating it so that it'll be more ready to access when we need it. So just to give you a sense that this particular thesis really makes a difference, and it's something we need to worry about and care about. I'm going to argue, first of all, that this is incoherent and ambiguous. So that's number one. And number two, if we don't scrutinize and resist at least some parts of it, it's dangerous. And so it's a little bit sort of the duck soup. It makes no sense, but it's we should resist it in any event. Now, this is what I'm going to do in the talk today to get to that place. So here we have the big data thesis, regulate use, not collection. Some part of the talk, I'm going to try and create a sharper target. So I've said that it's incoherent to some extent, and also it's ambiguous. Here are the two elements that I'm going to focus on. What is use? What do people mean, really? What is use and what is collection? To know what we're actually talking about. And second of all, to think about, are people in these, when they think about those, the quotations that I showed you at the beginning, are they saying that we cannot regulate collection, therefore we should regulate use? Or are they saying we should not regulate collection and we should leave all the regulation to use? Because there's a lot of slippage back and forth, and depending on which one you go with, the arguments for and against can be significantly different. Then I'm going to, having just focused in on what I think is a somewhat coherent and unambiguous claim, this part is the evaluation, to say, how plausible is it? Is this a good idea? Should we do it? It's an evaluation of the thesis. So here we are now at the first point, which is trying to sharpen this thesis. What is collection and what is use? And I've simplified somewhat by saying that if we think about, say, Craig Mundie, when we think about this concept of collecting information or collecting data, and I'm actually teaching a seminar, a graduate seminar this semester on critical perspectives on big data, and it's almost mind-boggling to think about what it is to collect data, because even that concept is bizarre. It suggests that data is kind of lying around like stones on the street, and we just run around and collect it. But that, of course, is not what is happening. The assembly or the data is actually constructed. And so when we say collect data, we're saying, construct data. But of course, there's lots of different kinds of data. And to suggest that there's this thing that you can remove from use called collection is really not to understand what's going on when data is collected. So let's just see if we can tease these things apart. Let's imagine there's a way in which we can talk about collection. It could be, you walk into this room and there's a motion detector and it sends a little signal to the computer that you've entered. So some data has been collected. And then later on, we use the data to make, the police come running in because maybe we think there's an intruder. So that's a way in which this data now has been collected and used. Of course, that's unusual. A lot of the time what happens is that data that's collected has to be interpreted. So even something as atomic as the click of the mouse, that is worthless data. You need to know, is that mouse click a click on an ad? Is it a click on a link? What kind of a click is it? So right away, there needs to be some kind of interpretive work that's done to identify what that data is. And so it's unclear whether that's part of the collection activity or that's already part of the use activity, the interpretation of this datum as something of a certain kind. And so in the middle of uptake and application, I've included this term processing, which is capturing many, many, many things. So one part of processing that's very important, of course, in the world of big data is that I store this data in a database. I store it in a structured way in the database so that it is subject to certain kinds of queries. I can take the database and I can aggregate it with another database that I have. And so that's one set of processing activity. And then I can, as we know, I can run all sorts of analytics on that data, and I can draw a number of inferences based on that data about you or about various subjects. And that's a very important part of the whole big data phenomenon, the data analytics, the data science, the predictive analytics, and so on. So many people, when I spoke to one of the PTAC members, I asked her, what do you mean? Where does all this sharing of the information, the processing, the inference drawing, where does that fit in your view? And she said, oh, no, that's use. I believe that that's use. Other people will say, oh, no, that's all part of the collection activity. So as you can see, there's some people who want to think or who seem to claim that you can have the bare elements of collection be uptake, and then everything else, processing and the application of it. So maybe, for example, on the basis of all this information about you that I've collected, I reckon that you're a good candidate for credit, for a credit card, and I'm going to give you, you're a good candidate. And then what am I going to do? I'm going to give you credit. I'm going to decide that I'm going to offer you a credit card with favorable terms. That's the decision. But everything else that happened in order to arrive at that, we're going to call processing. Some people will say the processing part is part of the collection, and the use part is only that part. So when you remember, say, what Craig Mundy was saying, he, I think, was suggesting the uptake and processing were all part of collection, which should not be regulated. And it was only at that moment of who am I going to offer the job to, am I going to send you diaper ads, as in the Target case, because I have figured out that you're very likely to be pregnant. It's the action, it's the decision leading to some action, and that's the application of the information in some kind of use. So I believe that if, again, in the interest of coherence, one cannot separate the uptake and just call that the collection with everything else being the use. If you go down this path and would like to suggest that collection can be regulated, but not, collection, we should not regulate collection, but regulate only use, we cannot avoid, and this is, I can discuss it more, but I won't do that right now. We cannot avoid taking uptake and processing as part of the collection activity and only application as part of the use activity. All right, I hope that was clear. So that's one part of the clarification to make. The second is to ask the question whether the thesis, this big data exceptionalism thesis, is a normative assertion or merely a descriptive assertion. Are people, and I think here, if you remember the quotes that I gave at the beginning, there's a little bit of both of it. Some of it, say with Craig Mundy, he seems to say both. He seems to say it's impossible now, and there are a number of different reasons why this is the case. First, we can say that it's just too complicated. There's just everything you do leaves a data trail. Sometimes the data it could be something where you consciously are filling out a form or answering questions. Sometimes it's just by dint of doing something else, as he says, it's the data exhaust. It's accepting someone as a friend on Facebook, and ultimately there's the social graph that emerges from those connections, which has nothing to do with you saying, here's my social graph, but more by accepting certain friends. And it's just all of these interactions for the intermediaries, for example, when you perform a Google search, there's the search term, but of course there's all the metadata surrounding that. There is no way to perform the services or perform the actions that you need without generating and without Google having access to this data. So that's part of the cannot. Sorry, I should have had that already. So some people are saying, no, it cannot, and these are reasons of what I'm calling metaphysics, architecture, and implementation. It just happens that we really cannot regulate it without stopping the performance of many of these vital activities. The second is interesting because I think that's where Bert-Jaap Coeps comes from. That's what provokes him saying what he says. And Timothy had mentioned fair information practice principle, and the EU regulations are very much, and these are just two elements of the fair information practice principle. One is the importance of consent in the regulation of privacy. So the idea, and the second one is purpose specification. So in any kind of information exchange, FIPS requires that the collector and the processor of the data be able to specify the purpose and then only use the data in ways that are consistent with that particular purpose. And if they want to do anything else, they need to come to you and get consent. So one of the concerns, for example, in healthcare is to say, look, we're collecting a lot of information, but we get more and more competent as the years go by. So I may have collected blood samples, or I may have collected information about you, but then, say, 5 years later, we have a much better understanding of this particular type of cancer that you have, and now we want to go back and reanalyze the data, and this is such a headache to go back and get consent. And also for these little micro bits of data, it's really impossible. It's just practically impossible to get consent. So they say because of that, because they identify protection of privacy in these terms, they say it's impossible to do because this is what collection regulation would require. Now, here is where, okay, I'll come back to it in a moment. Contextual integrity, which is the definition of privacy that I offer, also confronts certain hurdles. Institutional momentum is another reason why many people consider it, we cannot prevent the collection of data, because there are very powerful companies, some I've mentioned already, Apple, Facebook, Google, whose livelihoods, whose existence has and profitability depends on being pretty much unregulated in the data they collect. And so there's simply too much at stake. It's impossible to go to these companies and say, here is how we're going to regulate your collection of data. Now, I would like to push back on the cannot interpretation of the thesis. First of all, as you see, difficult does not mean impossible. There are many things that are difficult. The narcotics trade, financial fraud, these things are difficult. So that doesn't mean that we throw up our hands and we say, oh, we just can't do it. We just can't do it. It's just too difficult. It's too complex. We say, yes, it's difficult, but we're still going to try all sorts of approaches because we believe it's a problem. Contextual integrity, here's where contextual integrity comes into play. One, when I hear colleagues talk about this issue, there's a kind of slippage where they say we can't stop the collection of data. And the pushback that comes from contextual integrity, and this is just a quick slide, I'm obviously not going to go, which is to say that there are different ways of regulating collection short of stopping the collection. We can allow the collection of information, but we can regulate how the onward flow takes place. Of course, we can regulate use as well, which is, I think, why some people are suggesting that we should regulate use and not collection. But there are other ways to regulate the collection activity if we accept that collection involves the uptake and also the processing. We can, for example, require that the information flow in very specific ways and not in other ways. So the institutional, the kind of cynicism about the concern for institutional momentum, I am cynical. Well, I think at times I'm pessimistic about the possibility of reining in the companies, the large, the huge global companies that are the dominant players today. I've seen in the case of the EU where they're incredibly motivated to curtail some of the activities even in Europe, and they find it virtually, I mean, I may be proven wrong, but up until now they have not seem to have had a great impact, besides a few skirmishes here and there, which I think Facebook and Google, maybe they allow them to win those just to make them feel okay. But I haven't seen that. So one word of warning then is, if we believe that we're not going to be able to push back or to stop this institutional momentum in the case of collection, I'm not sure that we're going to be able to push back on use either. We seem to have an optimism that we give up on collection, but let's focus on use. But it's just not clear to me that if we give up on collection, and some of you may know this concept of a fence around the Torah, like if you give that up, we're going to have as hard a time on use. So we need to figure out what it is we want and then try to achieve it even in the realm of collection. So that's, I don't think that the cannot argument holds much water. We need to think about how and what it is that our goals are in regulating collection. And when I say regulating collection, I don't, as I say, mean stop collection, but really regulate it or constrain the collection and the onward flow and for example, the length of retention and what sort of analysis people can perform. So the should not, if you now interpret, say, the Craig Mundie or Tenay and Polonetsky or the PTAC report, if you understand that as saying not that we cannot regulate collection, but that we should not, we dare not, here are some of the arguments that you see people make. One is that when you try to impose a regulation on collection, you are going to interfere with certain fundamental rights and values. And the other one is that there's a foreclosure of benefits. I'm only going to spend just a few seconds on the first one because this discussion is one that we've had for years in the arena of privacy. Many people have pointed out that privacy stands in conflict with many other values and rights, and so we have to make trade-offs and so forth. There's only one part of this that is important to mention, and that is that in the case of inference, there is what has emerged is a strong First Amendment concern, which is that if people have assembled the data and then from the data they're drawing certain kinds of inferences, it's a First Amendment right to do so. We can't stop people from gleaning knowledge from the information they have. So that's a new concern that emerges particularly in the big data arena, given the kind of new extraction of knowledge that we get from various forms of data analytics. But I'm going to spend most of the time on the argument, because I think this is the dominant argument, and maybe for me it's the most persuasive argument, which is this idea of foreclosure of benefits. So what are the benefits that you hear people, and if you've heard anybody talk about big data, or if you've read some of the popular literature or even the scholarly literature on big data as a, and by the way, I mean, I'm using the term big data it's always like big data because it's not a term that has a very particular meaning, and I'm going to assume that we all have a sense of what I'm referring to, just the collection of vast amounts of data that's often too big for one database, that we have new modes of data mining and predictive analytics, and we now count what we extract from the data as knowledge. So it's an epistemological stance that we've assumed in relation to data. So there are many benefits that are espoused. One, as you see, we have what big data offers is these prodigious capacities to collect, store, analyze. We have new modalities of collecting information. Because of improvements in bandwidth, this data can move around much more cheaply and easily. Storage, we have different kinds of database technologies. And one of the things that has been impressed upon me is that data that we used to think was not very useful because it was very sparse, for example, in the case of rare diseases, or in the cases where we only have a few samples of some particular action, we might say it's statistically impossible to extract knowledge from this. Now, because we can assemble a huge amount of it, we can extract greater understanding from the data, much greater than we ever could before. We have the capability of performing analytics and also making algorithmically based decisions over the data. And of course, there are these dazzling success stories, the drug interactions, the fact that our credit cards can pick up credit card fraud based on understanding what normal use is and then being triggered when something unusual happens. And then some of the famous ones like assembling Major League Baseball teams using big data. And of course, I put the star by the flu trends because for many years, or a few years, the flu trends was offered as a rationale for allowing Google to store all the searches to say, look, we can extract some really useful stuff from maintaining searches. We were able to track flu trends, but evidently I'm told that actually this phenomenon no longer is replicable. So these are the kind of front page things. These are, I think, impressive, and maybe not each one front page news stories, but all of these areas where big data is affecting how we perform things. I have a colleague who found his loved one on OkCupid, and I was so surprised, like, he's a handsome young man. Why do you have, but of course, he said, well, the algorithm is going to be so much better than me in identifying who my life partner. I'm going to be distracted by all sorts of superficial things. So I was impressed. I'm not going to tell you anything more about him because he will be de-anonymized, and that will not be a good thing. All right, so these are the benefits. The point that I failed to make, actually, I realized earlier, in order to enjoy the benefits, you might say, and this is where contextual integrity runs into a similar problem to the FIPS kind of regulation of privacy. One of the reasons it's very difficult to kind of naively insist that we must regulate collection using the same mechanisms of privacy protection that we've always utilized, like purpose specification and consent. And for contextual integrity, the requirement is constraint on flow based on some of the also purposes and values that they promote. And this is the pushback that many people who are the boosters of big data, what they'll say is that we actually don't know ahead of time. We cannot define the purposes. Right now, we're just hoarding the data. Maybe in a few years, or perhaps if suddenly we can put this data together with this data, out will come some magic. And so, for example, I was recently at an NIH workshop where HIV researchers were saying they're going to try and utilize big data to give them some insights into HIV treatment or the identification of HIV or people at risk for HIV, to look at more found databases, to look at much more varied databases, not the kind of databases that typically an NIH researcher would curate. And the idea is that from these databases, we may be able to find some very useful information that might lead to advances in the identification, in the prediction, in the treatment of HIV. And these surely were not the rationale. For example, social media data, this was not the rationale for the collection of the social media data, but because it can be helpful, the argument is that some of the techniques we've had to protect privacy are no longer useful for us. So the way many people in this community, and there's emerged a field called data ethics, is to say, look, here are some of the issues that have worried us. So one of the biggest ones is in the arena of social justice and discrimination, and I'm going to say unfair discrimination because colleagues in data science will say, well, of course we want to discriminate. That's the whole point. We want to say these are the people to send the ads to because they're more likely to click and not to these people. So I like to use the word unfair discrimination just to make sure that we know what we're dealing with. Unfair, that's one of the biggest, a lot of people are writing about how algorithmic decision making on top of big data can discriminate against people who are already on the lower socioeconomic echelons, job, employment problems, as we know, interest rates, problems with price discrimination, and who gets the good offers from the various companies, what insurance rates you get based on a whole lot of information about you, whether some landlord decides that you're a good bet to give an apartment to. So there are these concerns about unfair, and I would say a really good literature has arisen. So the data ethicist says, privacy is a little bit old-fashioned, and let's really focus on use because that's where all the action is happening. But let's be ethical. So they come at it kind of agreeing that it's too late to do anything about collection, but let's apply all our ethical ammunition on the use part of the action. So another has to do with data quality and error and who suffers as a result of that. Another concern has, actually I didn't list it, but anyway, to some extent, I have colleagues who are looking at how big data is used in the political arena to target voters down to the individual with certain particular kinds of messages, and how this might perhaps interfere negatively with the political process. And so we think about things like manipulation. We're concerned about filter bubbles, personalization, which are all part of what big data does very well to identify you as this kind of person and then treat you in a certain way. And the data ethicist would say, all right, we can see this happening. Let's distinguish between those that are acceptable and those that are not. That's where we should have the discussion. And finally, there's a concern about opacity and due process, which is that many decisions that get made about us, we want a reason. Why were we not given the apartment? Why did we not get the job? Why this rather than that? And one of the concerns about algorithmic decision making is that we won't be in many cases the machine learning algorithms can give us reliable decisions that predict outcomes well, but not in a way that's intelligible to a human being. And so we may find ourselves subject to certain kinds of decisions that we simply do not understand why they happened in that way. So the optimism of the data ethicist is to say, this is all we've got. We can't stop the collection, but we can do something about the use. Let the collection happen, and we can do something about it. So this now is perhaps the heart of some of my own critique. And I've called this the reality factor. And now there are two parts of this argument. One is to ask, who is we? We are given the story. We should not resist collection. We should not stop collection because we can benefit so much from all the big data machinations. Reality? Who actually holds most of the data in the world? Now, I have to say, I'm just hazarding a guess, and I wish there was some way to actually measure things like how much data is there in the world, and what percentage of that data does, if you look collectively, Google, Facebook, Apple, Amazon, some of the big entities have. They have control of a lot. So what confidence do I have that all this data that we're being asked to yield without any control, without any limit, is actually going to be used in the ways that are the reasons why I should not complain that the data is being collected? And so here is what it is. These are the businesses, and this is us. Sometimes a business interest and my interest, like the imperative, the profitability interest of the business, is the same as mine. The business wants to create a product and service that I like and that improves my life, and that's a great thing. So we may say, look at all these neat things that we've gotten from these companies. That's a happy thing. But when we now think about the FluTrends example, we say, look, now Google decided that they wanted to demonstrate all the benefits of logging and maintaining all the search. So they did the FluTrends thing, which was, okay, it was a good thing. It didn't pan out completely. But what if all of us could say, hey, Google, here's what we would like you to do with that data? Because these are actually the things that are in the public interest. So by not allowing that, and they don't, of course, there's enormous opportunity cost, even though we have the benefits. Fraud detection by the credit card companies. Isn't that a very happy thing, that the credit card companies have invested a lot of effort and ingenuity to be able to identify when some purchase that you made is fraudulent, and they save you. Why? But that's, again, not to be too cynical, because in 1974 we passed the Fair Credit Billing Act, and that actually made the credit card companies liable for fraudulent uses of a credit card, not the merchant to swallow it, and not the individual user, but to make the credit card company responsible. And now the credit card companies are trying to make sure that they don't lose. So it's true that we are very pleased that they're doing this work to detect fraud. But without that Fair Credit Billing Act, what are the chances that there would be that level of investment in fraud detection? In some cases, the confluence ain't so happy, and we're not sure that the benefit of the companies is the benefit of the individuals. And in some instances, it's a zero-sum arrangement that the companies who are collecting the data may actually be utilizing it in ways that run contrary to our own interest, such as in the case of, let's say, medical insurance that by law is collecting a lot of information. But what are they doing with this information? A lot of what they're doing is to decide what premiums they're going to charge us. And then in some instances, the data is actually being used to shift risk away from the collector and processor of the data onto the data subject themselves. Finally, I'm going to leave you with this little thought experiment. Those were all the provocations of who is we, the arguments I don't think hold water. But finally, I want to become a little bit philosophical and have us do a thought experiment. Go back to I didn't put the date, 1791, when the amendments were ratified. Someone here, a historian. And to say this, let's imagine now we're in the world, but we're just, here's the Fourth Amendment, we're deciding what to do. So instead of what we have now, I'm going to do the big data argument. I'm going to say, look, this is old-fashioned. Let the police collect everything, and then we're just going to constrain their use. We're really putting a dampener on their capacity to fight crime by making them jump through hoops, even to collect the data. So let them have the data. I feel like I'm now in class. What do you think of that? Who thinks that's a good idea? Well, the other option is, the other option is just to have it as we have today, which is that in order to, say, go and listen into someone's phone call, you need to show probable cause and get, I don't know if it's a warrant, probably a warrant, and now we can do it. This other option, the kind of improved version, says you can collect anything you want, go to the phone companies, they'll give you the data, etc. But we're going to punish you if you use the data incorrectly. Now, I think that none of us would go for this. Even if we said things like, we're not going to go for stop and frisk, we're not going to poke you with a needle and do a drug test or check your urine or all of those. We understand those are invasive, but we now have techniques. We can use thermal imaging, we can tap your phone, we can ask the ISP to give us all the flows of the data, etc. So what's the problem with this? Now, the answer to this is where the dose of reality or the reality check comes in. And that is historically, we know that knowledge is power, and that powerful entities historically, there's no necessity, but historically, government has there are many instances. We may think Obama's a good guy, the NSA is doing their job, we trust them, but we have a lot of instances, enough instances in history to understand that there's a problem. And so I've found Philip Pettitt's work on republicanism, and he defines domination. We want to avoid domination. And what is domination? Domination is not the fact that a government, say, could curtail your freedom, but that the government has the power to curtail your freedom. And that's a very different thing. Having the data gives actors the power. Even if they don't exercise it, they have the power. And to be free, we need to be free of domination, which is we need to free ourselves from others having the power to act in relation to us in an arbitrary way. I think we have a concern now of private sector domination. This is now my last substantive slide. Because given now that there is the possibility of algorithmic decision making that we cannot query, we cannot say, why did I get a coupon to Gap and you did not? We can't. that is an arbitrary decision that's being made, and there are now powerful entities out there, including governments, who are able to affect our lives in an arbitrary way, and that is something that we want to put a stop to. And the way we put a stop to that is by curtailing collection, because once they have the data, we are now vulnerable. So that's the recommendation. Thank you.
I just wanted to thank, I wanted to take the moderator's privilege and ask you a few questions, if that's okay.
Sure.
First, and then open it up to louder questions. First of all, great talk, Helen. That was fantastic, as usual. It seems to me that part of your conclusion really just goes back to, as someone who thinks about these from a legal perspective, to what Luigi Brandeis said more than 100 years ago in his article along with Samuel Warren of The Right to Privacy, that there are injuries that the law should, the whole point, the thesis of that article was that there are injuries that the law should recognize, that the law recognizes intangible injuries and not just tangible injuries, so that there should be a lawsuit for invasion of privacy similar to lawsuits that you would have for tangible personal injuries. And it seems to me like the most extreme use of the thesis you were talking about is, no, we should forget those intangible injuries. We should only look at the actual tangible injury that the invasion of privacy causes, which would be a step, back for more than a century. So that just struck me about your talk, and I don't know if you'd thought about Brandeis at all in thinking about how you're going to put this talk together into an article.
I'm inspired by Warren and Brandeis article very much, but what I'm trying to do is, it goes the heart, like some of the devil is in the detail. So what I'm attempting to do is to even reveal why these things, the collection, is harm, where, because many people will not see harm, even tangible or not intangible. I don't think that line is. So in the use case, it could still be an intangible harm, but the tough part of this project is to show why the complex, the collection, by which I mean the uptake and the processing, is also something that we should fight back against. So it's within, you could put it within the rubric, but you would still need to do that work of trying to classify it as such.
Sure, and just one more question before we open it up. I spent several years of my life actually thinking about the question of what is collection in the context of the NSA. It just struck me in your discussion of collection how much thinking is done on this issue in a national security context where we're kind of primitive in this broader big data context. You talked about 3 steps. You talked about uptake, processing, and use. We could break it down quite a bit more than that. And certainly in the NSA, thinking of the NSA, the way they think of it is first you have the acquisition of the raw signal, which could be digital or analog. Remember, the NSA goes way back to the 50s. Then you have the processing of that signal into usable data, which could involve decrypting it or just formatting it in a usable form. Then you have the translation and analysis, assuming it's a communication, because it's not very useful if you're an American intelligence agency and the signal is in Urdu. And then you have, after the translation and analysis step, you have the reporting in an intelligence report and dissemination to another agency. And the way you described collection, there are people that would say none of that is collection, in which case the NSA doesn't engage in any activity which should be regulated. If you take the most extreme point of view, they don't do anything. They're not like the CIA. They don't conduct operations. They simply collect, analyze, and disseminate information. So, you know, you could be
You're
even
saying
stronger.
it's all collection.
Well, they would regard collection at some point along that stage, and we could spend another hour and a half describing exactly where that is. But the most extreme description of kind of this big data paradigm that you gave in your talk would say, no, it doesn't matter until we get to the actual decision. They don't make any decisions. The only decision they make is to have a report, which is by definition information,
Right.
going to an agency that's going to use it to make a decision.
Well, I mean, you're absolutely right. And the thing is that the reason I use the Fourth Amendment
Yeah.
case is that people who are wholly supportive of the regulate use and not collection make an exception when it comes to government. So they would absolutely reject what, you know, this. I know you're not saying we should do this, but you're showing what a kind of absurd
Yeah.
conclusion. But these people would take government out of the equation. I want to bring government back in because what I want to do is to explain that the rationale for worrying about why we don't want to let the NSA do all these things without any oversight and regulation and accountability whatsoever, those same reasons are at play even when we think about non-governmental entities. So it's almost to say, look, this nobody agrees with, yet they're saying this. So, but let's understand why. Is it just some dogmatic feeling that we need to regulate government? Or is there something underneath it? And I think the point underneath it, and I think I didn't really make it clear enough, is that, first of all, there's this reality check concern. Government in the old days was the most powerful actor and had enormous, you know, they had guns, they had police, they had all those ways to tyrannize individuals. But in the world that we're in today, I believe there are entities that have significant impact on the outcomes in our lives. And the same reasons that that political theorists have applied to regulate government, we now really need to look more generally.
Okay.
I've heard individuals say that privacy, in fact, I'll name him Sean Canuck, who's in the National Intelligence Council, say that he thinks that privacy might be an artifact of the industrial age. By that, I think he meant that privacy probably didn't exist in tribal communities. That is to say, it was very, very limited, because everyone knew everyone else's business. But once the industrial villages were constructed and people from different tribes or communities came together, security was again paramount, as it was in the tribe. In the tribe, in the village, you don't mind others knowing your business, except perhaps for the most intimate details, because you want your children not to be, you want them to be supervised by others in the community. If a stranger comes into town, you want the word to go out quickly. But in the industrial villages, you're there with other communities. What do you think of that as a way to test whether or not the use of information is acceptable? And let me just say, as you know, the young people today freely put their information on the web. They disclose everything. The older people won't do that. So is privacy a subjective quantity, or is it, can you give an objective measure that applies to all cases?
Should I answer each one as it comes in?
Sure.
Okay. So, I mean, that's a very rich question, and I don't agree with the premise that privacy is an industrial age sort of new phenomenon. It may be the word was new, and it's true that in some cultures, and I have Japanese colleagues who say there is no word for privacy, in a natural word in the Japanese language. However, I mean, I looked these up. In the 10th century, for example, there was a rabbi who said you shouldn't open, he issued a decree against opening people's sealed communications. And even in the Bible, there's a description, like when the Israelites were wandering in the desert and you had to set up your tents, there was a requirement that you not set your tent up so that the entrance of your tent would look directly into the entrance of someone else's tent. Now, I'm sure they didn't have the word privacy in those days, but if you think about privacy as contextual integrity, which I do, which I think about as constraints on information flow, and it could be things like gossip is bad and so forth. We've always, I would argue that as long as people live together, they have these kinds of constraints on information flow, which absolutely change as the situations and the circumstances change. So in that village, I know people's business, they know my business, I don't know Google's business. You know, they're radical differences. And so when I hear, I hear it a lot, and I say, first of all, we know each other's business for the most part. Second of all, we're sort of equally as powerful. And by the way, when Hippocrates, thousands of years ago, was a physician, one of the principles of the Hippocratic Oath was not to divulge. I think that's privacy. So it was different. Those teenagers that are putting things, and by the way, I think they're a lot more cautious today than, they still get upset when their mom sees it. So they still have certain expectations. However, they do change, and those of us who are in the field, I think, really need to, again, be looking at the details of the change and not just saying, oh, it's a concept that's come and gone.
Just a couple of questions or observations. One is just to underscore what you said about the companies and the power of the companies in collecting information. They are not subject to Fourth Amendment constraints
Right.
in the way governments are. So that's a very important point to make clear. Another thing, too, in terms of, one of the things you're trying to do here, Alan, is add precision to this conversation, right? Or
Yeah.
shouting or whatever
Yeah,
you want
help.
to call it.
Yes.
So one of the other things that tends to get equated a lot, not only in this discussion, but more generally in the information policy space, is data and information. Those terms get used
Yeah.
interchangeably, right? So there's data, and then information is data with meaning attached, right? And there are definitions, like ISO has that definition. It's an accepted ISO definition. So what might be helpful, again, is to sort of parse a little bit more when, in terms of your collection, in your hierarchy there, parse when it's data and when it becomes information. That might be, helpful or may, and then just in terms of the main point of your talk, which is, really, to my mind, what's going on in the big data space right now, I mean, the quotes you had at the beginning, this is just the latest argument in the big hoovering of information,
Yeah.
right? So it's just, let's hoover all information up, so we'll have it all, and then we can figure out how to commercialize it. So some years ago, Fred Kate and Victor Meyer-Schumberger were hired by some corporations, and they wrote a big paper, and the paper was, this is just prior to big data breaking, right? And the thrust of their paper was, these limitations, they're old-fashioned, let's get used to them, let's get
Right.
rid of them, and let's just do use,
Right.
right? So this is that same argument just coming up, with the big data thing. At the same time, we know, right, from 40 years, that a patient lying unconscious in her hospital bed, so in terms of passivity, right, is still entitled to the same privacy rights that she would enjoy if she were walking around. So, that kind of vitiates in part, this argument about use. And to my mind, obviously, I think I've made it clear, and I would prefer to retain these kind of limitations. I think there's a lot of value and still a lot of legs in them, a lot of life there. Like some years ago, I wrote a chapter with Victor Meyer-Schumberger, before he wrote the thing with Kate's, about the life cycle of information too. So if you think about creation of information, then initial dissemination, broader use, and destruction. Again, there are more nodes there, but just that. So and that could be, personal information, it could be intellectual property, whatever it is. Most of the regulation around it is in those middle two. And that's because that's when the information is more visible, because it's moving, right? We have much less regulation around creation and destruction. One of the very few that we have regulation around creation is child pornography, right?
Right.
It's the mere creation. So that might also be, kind of a way to think about this kind of where they're arguing for the use, it's when the information is flowing.
Yeah, I'm gonna see how long I can get away with not having to distinguish data and information. I know there's that triangle, you know, data, information, and da-da-da, knowledge, wisdom at the very top, but anyway, I'm hoping I can do that. The thing, there are just a few different points, and there was a lot in what you said. One of the points is that when we talk about the regulation of collection, and I had mentioned this in passing, it's not to say that we must stop collection. These are many instances when we stop collection, but it's to say that we must be willing to hold people accountable for it, for the collection, so that we're still going to look at that Google Maps Street View engineer who figured out the hoovering up of the Wi-Fi communication data and say, no, that is problematic, you need to erase that, even if you inadvertently.
So I just can't, I can't resist this. When I was sitting in one of those rooms inside the government, we were trying to figure out what the rules for protecting U.S. persons would be for the newest intelligence agency, our own, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, which also had the National Counterterrorism Center. And everyone agreed around the room that we were not supposed to be doing collection. Our job was to analyze information shared with us from the other intelligence agencies. And of course, there are these definitions of collection I mentioned, so that sometimes information that hasn't been sufficiently processed is not considered to have been collected. So if some of that information was shared with us, and there was discussion of doing this, and I believe it was actually done, then we had this problem. The information wasn't collected by that agency, but we don't have the power to collect, so who did the collecting? And so I, being a smart aleck, popped up and said, well, this is the doctrine of the Immaculate Collection.
I mean, this is, by the way, this is a fundamental big data issue, and that's why I want to put uptake and processing all in one barrel. Because let's say you got a whole bunch of, you didn't collect it, you know,
Right.
but you got a whole lot of raw data, and now you're simply performing analytics on it, you're drawing inferences. Is that collection? You are creating new data.
Again, it goes back to your
Is it
definition
use?
of collection.
Exactly.
I think you're right to identify collection as a process. And then I think that part of what I was trying to do in breaking it down much further, you know, in the intelligence community, we think of the three big processes as collection, retention, and dissemination. And analysis happens mainly in the retention phase, but it can also happen as part of all these phases, really. But you can break it down in this way to think about, and the real question is, what is the rule that should attach at each stage? And there's not necessarily a fixed answer to that.
Right.
But you know, some things it's okay to collect huge bulk data and put it on a server and process it later. For other kinds of data, you can't do that. It's a Fourth Amendment violation if you do that. So the answer may not be the same, and it seems like a semantic question, but it's really not. It's a question about accountability. I think that's exactly the right way to put it, is if we think there needs to be a rule about what happens to data before it's collected, we're obscuring the accountability if we don't define our terms precisely. Questions? Sorry. In the back.
On your last slide, conclusion, you introduced this word accountability.
Oh, it's not, I'm not hooked up.
And I think we all can imagine that in your conclusion that the regulation of use is necessary. What's your distinction between regulation and accountability? Could you give me just some instances so I can?
No, well, I mean, I just used the word accountability
I know.
because What I meant by that is to say you need to answer for the collection. The current thesis, this big data exceptionist thesis that I was scrutinizing, the suggestion there, to quote Deborah, how do you go? Debbie, is to say just hoover it up, no questions asked. That is to say we're not holding you accountable for collection. That's how I use the term accountability. You are not, no one's going to hold you to account for the collection. I'm pushing back, I'm going to say, I'm going to hold you to account for the collection. You need to answer to some of the questions. And so it's just another way of saying to regulate. And again, it's regulation, because I'm not a lawyer and I'm not a policy wonk. When I say regulation, it could cover a range of different ways. So really, if you think about the Fourth Amendment, and I'm stepping way outside of my expertise here, you could say that we're not actually stopping the police from tapping phones. We're just saying that if you tap the phones, you cannot, you could ruin a court case because you're not going to be able to enter the evidence, and you may actually make it impossible to get the evidence that you need to say, find the criminal guilty. So you could, in a way, say you've regulated collection by regulating use. That's all right, as long as what you're trying to do is regulate the collection. But there are many, or you could have a professional code, or there are many different ways you can regulate. It's just to say we need to regulate.
Karen?
So, if we agree that we're in times of massive swirl around all of this, and even the use of the word Hoover is maybe not of knowledge to some people in the room, right? So we're in massive transition. If we agree to that, then what about the possibility that the only regulation that you apply to accountability is a regulation for transparency, so that everybody who's collecting, using, whatever, has a transparency requirement, and then the public can respond as we watch what evolves after that.
Yeah, I mean, it also depends on what you want to be transparent. So some people are saying, let's this is on the use side. Let's make the algorithm. Let's insist that the algorithm be understandable, so we know them. But they have, in a way, the current regulation is that very poorly enacted. But it's to say that you have to have a privacy policy that explains what you're collecting, etc.
Any more questions?
I don't think. No, I wanted to just say that that does not work. It doesn't work because it's impossible to actually say everything that you need to tell people in order for them to make a good decision. Sorry, I just need to take a minute, because this is what you've just put your finger on, is a very active discussion, which is to say, even if the transparency action, that activity, is not sufficient for people to make a decision, be it the individual subject or some other actor who's acting on behalf of the individual, perhaps there is still a good social purpose to be served by insisting on transparency. So I think that's the part of the story that we would need to develop more, which is that what purpose do we hope to serve with transparency? It may be like post-fact, we're going to hold you accountable, and that's why you have to, or whatever. And in some cases, I think it's a good thing, and in some cases, I'm not sure it's helpful. Yeah.
Fantastic talk. Sir, very similar question to the data information, perhaps, thing that you mentioned.
You could do that for me, guys.
No, so
Okay.
the question is, how far you go back? When do you start collecting? I mean, in the sense that it seems to me that
Yeah.
there's no when does it going back to the immaculate consumption phrase that you said? It seems to me is it a material when you start collecting, when you store something? I mean, is it, or how do you prevent something when you, so I'm just trying to figure
Yeah.
out, like, how do you?
When
kind
is,
of-
when is
When is something collected? I mean,
become data? When does it even become data?
you said
Conception.
constructed, I mean, that's
Yeah.
nice, that's a nice move, right? But I'm trying to see,
Yeah.
like, how does it become collected? I mean, and if you wanna regulate it, where would you start? So that's the transparency move seems to be one way to kind of, pin it down. But, I'm just trying to look for like some guidance of thinking about, collection as an act.
Right, so I'm gonna worm out of it, because otherwise we're gonna be here till 7, because my head is breaking when I think about when does the data actually come into existence. However, the way I can finesse this a little bit, it's like you know it when you see it. I'm gonna say there is stuff that we know is data that's already constructed, and the point that I want to make is a little bit minimal, which is to say that it's not necessarily. There are many ways to regulate. Again, going back to contextual integrity, there are different ways to regulate. One is to say who can collect, and your case was really interesting because you were saying, this intelligence agency that you worked for was not entitled to collect. So some people can't. We can restrict who can collect. We can restrict, again, what types of information. We can restrict then the onward flow of the information and so on. All of these are efforts to regulate collection without just saying, period, no data should be collected by anybody. And if we allow ourselves those different dimensions or those parameters to be filled, we can actually see some interesting ways to regulate collection without necessarily saying it cannot be created at all.
So I think that's probably all the time we have. No, we have time for one more question, if anyone has a question that they're burning to ask. Well, if not, this was a fantastic second speaker for our cybersecurity speakers period. Thank you very much, Alan.